Mark Pocan, Member of Congress.
Without objection, the resignation is accepted. What purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Democratic Caucus, I offer a privilege resolution and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Resolution 393, resolved that the following named member be and is hereby elected to the following standing committee of the House of Representatives. 1. Committee on Education and the Workforce. Mr. Pocan.
Without objection, the resolution is agreed to and the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. That's good. For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 391 and Section 1002E of the Continuing Appropriations Act 2014, I have a motion at the desk.
Clerk will report the motion.
Mr. Young of Indiana moves that the House proceed to consider House Joint Resolution 99.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman will suspend. Pursuant to Section 1002E2B of the Continuing Appropriation Act 2014, the motion is not debatable. The question is on the motion. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The motion is adopted. The clerk will report the title of the joint resolution.
House Joint Resolution 99, Joint Resolution relating to the disapproval of the President's exercise of authority to suspend the debt limit as submitted under Section 1002B of the Continuing Appropriations Act 2014 on October 17, 2013.
Pursuant to House Resolution 391 and Section 1002E2C of the Continuing Appropriations Act 2014, the joint resolution is considered as read, and the previous question is considered as ordered on the joint resolution to its passage without intervening motion, except 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Young, as the proponent, and the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, as the opponent. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Indiana.
Mr. Speaker, I also ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on the subject of the bill under consideration.
Without objection, order.
Mr. Speaker, some people may be wondering why we find ourselves here today. Some people may be confused as to why we're voting on a resolution to disapprove of the debt limit suspension 2 weeks after the fact. And some people may be asking why I introduced this resolution of disapproval on behalf of some people who voted yes and others who voted no to give the President the authority to suspend the debt limit. The answers to these questions are much simpler than they might appear. We're here today because the United States of America carries a debt load of over $17 trillion and counting. We're voting on this resolution today because this is the procedure that was put in place by the Senate when they crafted a package to end the government shutdown. Now, many of us voted for that Senate legislation largely because we didn't think it was responsible to risk defaulting on our national debt. However, I introduced this resolution, and a majority of House members will vote to disapprove because it's also not responsible to ignore the problems created by our long-term debt. Mr. Speaker, despite the fact that a large number in this body voted to avoid default, it would be a gross mischaracterization to say that we approve of a debt limit suspension, absent adoption of bold policy reforms that will set our nation on a sustainable fiscal trajectory. We must break the habit of negotiating these fiscal deals at the last minute. We must stop kicking the can down the road, proverbially, skipping along from crisis to crisis. Simply put, enough is enough. Let's start talking across party lines about how to fix our debt problems now, not the end of a deadline. We know that programs like Medicare and Social Security are on unsustainable footing. That's why a Democrat president and Republican House have both offered up reforms for these programs. So if we agree there's a problem, why must we wait until the next crisis to address it? We know that our tax code is outdated and that it's become too larded up with narrowly tailored provisions that benefit only a small number of special interests. That's why our House Ways and Means Chairman has met weekly with the Senate Finance Chairman to discuss how best to achieve a fairer, flatter tax code in a bipartisan way. If there is agreement here, then why are we looking to self-impose fiscal deadlines in hopes of getting a deal? I could go on, but I think the point is clear. Washington missed an opportunity during our most recent fiscal showdown. This resolution sends a message that ignoring our problems does not make them go away. It sends a message that we should not wait until the last minute, but should reach across the aisle to face these challenges now. And it sends a message that we take these issues very seriously because they bear directly on job creation, personal income levels, and our collective faith in America's enduring exceptionalism. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution of disapproval, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Indiana reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I shall consume.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he shall consume.
Just a short time ago, a number of us joined many others in paying tribute to Speaker Tom Foley. There was a commemoration ceremony just 100 feet or so from here. There was a lot of discussion, inappropriately, of the need for bipartisanship. There was much reference to the role that Tom Foley played in that, in trying to reach across the aisle. And Bob Michel, the former leader on the Republican side, spoke so eloquently as to how there was a level of trust and how there was an effort at bipartisanship. I think what's happened in this House is that the increased polarization has really twisted this institution and has even, to some extent, twisted the ability to have close relationships. I say this because I think this resolution is not within that spirit. It was only the week before last that 87 House Republicans joined 198 House Democrats to pull this nation back from the brink of a default that would have magnified the economic damage inflicted by the Republican shutdown of this government. That was a bipartisan effort with leadership support from both sides of the aisle. And I can understand why those who voted no on October 16 might vote yes on this bill in order to be consistent. And while I disagree with the policy, at least their vote would be consistent. I think the vote would be consistently wrong, but it would be consistent. What's hard to understand is how anybody who voted yes on October 16 to avoid a default would now vote yes on this bill that would bring about a default. So you talk about the message. Essentially, the message of this bill is, once again, we will utilize the threat of default. That's what this bill says. When you vote for it, that's precisely what you're saying. So you're saying that serious impairment of our nation's full faith and credit, which economists warned would plunge us back into recession, was a bad idea on Wednesday 2 weeks ago, but doing so is a good idea on Wednesday 2 weeks later. We're going to vote tomorrow. That's precisely what you're saying. That is your message. So the same person who voted one way then is soon going to vote the other way. And let me just say why I think this is not within the spirit of an effort at bipartisanship that I referred to earlier, and that I think is so important. And the lack of any effort at that has really twisted, I use that word, the strength of this institution. Just a short time ago, a few weeks ago, as the Republicans took us to the brink of default, the minority leader on the Senate side said, and I quote, There's no education in the second kick of a mule. And he continued, and we're not going to do this again in connection with the debt ceiling or with a government shutdown, end of quote. That's precisely what this legislation says. Precisely. It says, forget about the second kick of a mule. What it says is that you would do it again in connection with the debt ceiling. So that's your message. And you would do that, you would take us to the brink of default that earlier this month, the Council of Economic Advisors estimated lost 120,000 jobs that would have been created in October, and the private forecasters estimated slowed fourth quarter GDP growth by between 0.2 and 0.6%. So I think there's no escape from the inconsistency. There's no escape from essentially saying once again, there's no real effort to reach across the aisle. There's no real effort to try to instill some belief that the two parties can work together. So that's a bad message. And I guess a lot of you think you can be inconsistent because it will never come up in the Senate. And it won't. But that doesn't take away the fact that there is a consistency here, I guess, to try to cover some people's votes, to somehow minimize their impact. But you know, when it comes to the default or the full faith and credit of this country, there has to be something more important than providing us cover. We need to provide cover for the citizens of this country so that they are not vulnerable to playing with the default and the full faith and credit of this country. So you shouldn't be bringing up this resolution. It will pass, I guess. There will be enough inconsistent votes, and it will go nowhere. But it sends the very, very wrong message. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Michigan reserves. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have so much respect for the long-standing service and distinguished tenure of my colleague on the other side of the aisle, and I just think that there's some clarification that's required for this body and all who may be watching this evening's proceedings. So let me begin by reminding those who would review the record. I'm not sure I invoked the words Republican or Democrat in my opening comments. If I did, it certainly wasn't in a partisan nature. Instead, I extended a hand of friendship, tried to actually increase trust, and offered the hope that we might work together. We might actually work together to work on the very problems that caused me to run for office for the first time in 2010. The $17 trillion national debt that I know has grown to a great degree during the service of the good gentleman on the other side of the aisle who just spoke. The unsustainable entitlement programs that when push comes to shove and we can no longer find the resources to fund them because people haven't made bold enough leadership decisions, those on the margins of society will be most adversely impacted. I know these are the things that my good ranking member friend on the other side of the aisle cares about every bit as much as I do. And we just have not yet come together and found bipartisan solutions to these things. Now, the continuing resolution vote that we passed, the package, if you will, just days ago, accomplished a few things. We indicated that the President could suspend the debt ceiling, but that move could be checked by votes of disapproval in the House and the Senate. So this is a process that was put into motion by that earlier bipartisan vote that occurred right here in this body. It is true that it's been made clear over in the other chamber, the Senate, that the ranking member will never, the leader there will never bring this bill up in the Senate. So that's been made eminently clear. The risk of default is certainly something that ought not be mentioned. We needn't spook the markets here. We will pay our bills in this country. That's something that I've been proud to stand for ever since I've been in this body. The continuing resolution package also indicated that on February 8, the debt limit would be increased to reflect the borrowing that occurred during the debt limit suspension period. And then the Treasury would be given the ability to create additional headroom via so-called extraordinary measures after the debt limit was reinstated on February 8, 2014. So that's the larger context here. Sounds to me very procedural, not particularly partisan. In fact, my hope was that this could be offered in the spirit of bipartisanship. This is a messaging bill. There was an allusion to, during my good friend's comments, an allusion to a message being sent, as if that is somehow a negative thing. Now, most of the bills that are introduced in this body are introduced, in part at least, to offer a message to the broader American people, and we stand here and argue on behalf of the message we're trying to drive home. The message I'm trying to drive home is that these debt problems have lingered on too long, and that to increase a debt limit, to suspend a debt limit, is certainly not to approve of further borrowing in the future, absent the sort of bold changes that, frankly, have not been enacted when my good friend has served many years in Congress. So that's the larger message here. That's how I would respond. With that, I want to yield to my distinguished colleague, the freshman gentleman from Ohio, who has a lot of life experiences and who's very hardworking, Mr. Winstrup.
How much time are we?
I'll yield 2 minutes.
Yields 2 minutes. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. You know, during World War II, man, woman, young, old, rich, poor, everyone in this nation pulled together to bring our country through a difficult time. It was a bipartisan effort for sure. And after the war, we cut spending, and we were a nation that went to work. But I ask my colleagues today, as we continue to increase our spending and run up our debt, what is the limit? At what point do you finally say, it's dangerous? It's dangerous for the future of America. Is there a limit? We can't keep going in this direction. No one in this body wants America to default. That's not good for this country. But we need to be as serious about what we plan for the future of this country. People are always saying, do it for the kids, do it for the kids. We do a lot for kids, and we can always do more for kids. But what about when those kids today are grown up and they're stuck with all this debt? What are we doing to them? The Temptations in the 70s had a song, said Papa was a rolling stone. And when he died, all he left us was alone. It was not a compliment. And if it was irresponsible in the 1970s, it's irresponsible today. I spoke earlier about the greatest generation and the legacy that they left. What's going to be our legacy? A legacy of nothing but debt? Can you imagine the potential for opportunity in this country, for investment and for jobs, if we are serious and we're on a solvent course for the United States of America? And the sooner we go in that direction, the more we can do to help Americans that are in need. It's about stability. It's about certainty for the United States of America. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Indiana reserves.
I yield myself 15 seconds. The gentleman from Indiana mentioned about spooking the market. Halloween's in a couple of days. And essentially what this bill says is that you would be willing to spook the market if you could. And that's the wrong message. Now I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New York, a veteran of these battles and a friend of Tom Foley's, Mr. Rangel.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
The gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Whoever hired the Republican consultant on keeping the majority should be able to get their money back. I had thought just a few weeks ago that a small group in this House had such an obsession with the Affordable Care Act and such a dislike for the President that they were prepared not only to close the government, but to attack the integrity of the full faith and credit of the United States. The scorn and ridicule that this caused this Congress, Democrats and Republicans alike, because of this strategy to repeal a bill that already had been signed into law and approved by the United States Supreme Court. You would think that no one would want to go anywhere near that again. But still, we have a bill before us that admittedly has already been rejected by the Senate because we want to remind the American people how totally irresponsible we have been in the past, and not only causing our great country to lose $125 billion, not only the job loss, not only the pain and sacrifice that so many people had gone through because they weren't paid for the work that they were supposed to be doing, but to have the whole country call us irresponsible and to have people who loaned us money be uncertain our ability to pay it back. And then we want to revisit this with a bill that's destined to go nowhere. You know, I am a partisan Democrat, but I'm more of a patriot. And I hate to see the Republican Party do this to itself, because I really think that our country needs another party, not just the Democratic Party. And I know that individuals don't care about the national Republican reputation. But what has happened here is that the irresponsibility, the ridicule, the insanity of these strategies has gone beyond the Republican Party in the House. It has now infested part of our party, and people are talking about the presidency in terms of bring on the clowns. So this is embarrassing to all of us as Americans, and especially as lawmakers. This body wasn't created for us to send messages. It was created for us to pass laws.
Expired. The gentleman from Michigan reserves. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
I yield 4 minutes to my fellow colleague from Indiana, the hardworking gentleman, Mr. Stutzman.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my friend from Indiana, Mr. Young, for introducing this legislation, this resolution. This is about communicating with the American people, and I'm not quite sure what to say after the last speaker, who said he was a partisan Democrat, would not want to come together, both parties, to work together to find a problem to the $17 trillion of debt that we have. I mean, that seems to be more of the problem in Washington today, is the fact that parties don't want to work together to find a problem to the threat to our children and our grandchildren. Mr. Young mentioned earlier that was the reason he ran for office, was because of the $17 trillion of debt that at the time in 2010 was roughly closer to $13 trillion, and it has only exceeded since we've been now elected to office. And I just find it astonishing that we are Americans first, not partisans, Americans who believe that we need to pass on a better future for our children and our grandchildren and for future generations here in America. That's what's wrong with Washington, is too many partisans. I believe we've got to find solutions that are going to balance the budget like Americans do across the country every day, whether it's filling up gas at the gas station or whether it's the book dues for the kids at school, health care cost, the cost of utilities. You know, people are trying to make ends meet, and instead Washington is only making it harder through partisanship on the American people. Both parties, Republican and Democrat, have driven Washington $17 trillion in debt. For decades, Republicans and Democrats offered empty promises and cheap excuses. But our fiscal crisis cannot be ignored anymore. The national debt now exceeds our gross domestic product and saddles every American with a $53,000 share of Washington's red ink. The facts are very clear. Our current path is unsustainable. Although Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security will grow dramatically over the next decade, recent budget debates between Congress and the White House have largely ignored these key drivers of the debt. So, what's going to happen? Washington is going to continue to stumble from one crisis to the next. This is no way to run a country. Madam Speaker, it is irresponsible to raise the debt ceiling without tackling the underlying spending problems of this crisis. Hoosiers don't expect Republicans and Democrats to agree on every proposal, but they do expect us to make the difficult choices to put us on a path of fiscal stability. Now is the time for both parties to break Washington's cycle of manufactured crises and pay down our debt. I thank the gentleman for bringing this resolution to the floor of the House so we can discuss not only the spending problems, but what is the problem underlying the spending habits and the spending problems in Washington. Is it just Obamacare, as the gentleman said previously? Obamacare is part of the problem of our spending in Washington. Washington continues to look out for Washington interests and special interests rather than looking out for American interests. So thank you, Mr. Young, for bringing this important resolution, because if there's anything that threatens our security, it is our national debt. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 2011, Admiral Mike Mullen, said that this is the greatest threat to our national security. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired.
I yield the gentleman another 1 minute.
Thank you.
The gentleman's recognized for one additional minute.
As I mentioned, Admiral Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 2011, after the last debt ceiling discussion in August, July and August of 2011, said that the debt was the greatest threat to our national security. Not only is it a threat to our ability to protect our country militarily, but it is an even greater threat to our country economically. And families are feeling the brunt day to day in the fact that salaries are not increasing, jobs are not being created. This is the fundamental crisis that our country is facing today, and we do need to talk about it. We do need to share with one another here in Congress ideas and ways that we can tackle our debt problems. So thank you, Mr. Young, for this resolution, and I proudly support it, and I'm glad to work with anyone, Republican or Democrat, to tackle our debt problems. I yield back.
The gentleman from Indiana reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Now my pleasure to you, to another member, a distinguished member of our committee, Mr. Davis of Illinois.
For what period of time? The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I want to thank the ranking member for yielding. Madam Speaker, I hope that we've learned from 3 weeks ago, and that we're not easing down the road to brinksmanship once again. Every American will pay another heavy price if some of our colleagues are able to trigger again another shutdown of the government. I agree with President Obama. The full faith and credit of our country is not negotiable. And if there are colleagues who are thinking about it, I would urge you, don't do it. Don't create higher mortgage costs. Don't cause investors to lose on their retirement plans. Don't cause doctors and hospitals to wonder whether or not they're going to be paid for treating Medicare and Medicaid patients. Don't cause student loans to go up. Don't create anxiety for more than 10 million seniors who will be wondering whether or not they're going to get their Social Security checks. Don't create concern among veterans who will be wondering whether or not they're going to get their disability benefit checks. And so anybody that might be thinking about it, I would urge you not to do it. Don't attempt to hold the debt ceiling hostage. But I would say, as it was said in the book of Isaiah, come and let us reason together. Because if we don't, then the whole country will suffer. Come and let us find a way to work in a way that our problems can be dealt with. I believe that we can do it. It's been done before. And I thank the gentleman for yielding. And I end with, let's do it. Let's show the American people that we can work in a bipartisan way and solve the problems and meet the needs of the people of this country. And I yield back.
The gentleman from Michigan reserves. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
I yield 3 minutes to my distinguished and colleague from Kansas, Mr. Huelskamp.
The gentleman from Kansas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I appreciate the efforts of my colleague from Indiana bringing this before the House for discussion. But the reality is, the staggering fact is that since the President's re-election through to the next debt limit vote, Washington will have added about $1 trillion to our national debt in exchange for what? For no spending reductions, in exchange for maintaining the status quo. This is not, as Democrats would argue, about paying our bills. It is about mortgaging our nation's future. Not only must we vote yes on this resolution to disapprove of this culture of debt, but it's also time to bring long overdue transparency to the process. As we approach the so-called default deadline, the White House press secretary told reporters that Secretary Lew did not say we risked default at midnight on October 17th, only that we were likely to exhaust our borrowing authority that day. The press corps, as you might recall, responded in disbelief that their doomsday default clocks may actually be wrong. But let's be clear. We were not going to default. Why do I say that? Ask the Vice President, who disappeared for a couple weeks. It was the Vice President who went to China in August of 2011 and told the Chinese we would never default. Moody's said we were not going to default. The markets showed little volatility. They knew we would not default. Default was just a scare tactic to scare the American people. And we as elected representatives had no access to the actual data to determine how much borrowing authority the Secretary, the administration had left. We were simply left to take Jack Lew's word for it. In the future, I believe we must require a fuller accounting of how extraordinary measures are used, reported, and are remaining by any administration. In the words of Ronald Reagan, we should trust but verify. And Madam Chairman, earlier this year, the President sent us a budget that never balances. Never balances. In fact, he has done that now for 5 straight years. That means under his plan, time and time and time and time and time again, we would only add to our national debt and never pay it off. A vote today to disapprove this debt limit increase may have little impact on the previous $17 trillion in debt, or the next $600 billion in debt that we approved as a body a few weeks ago. But it does say 3 things. It is time to end our culture of debt. It is time to end the Washington status quo. It is time to end the crisis of out-of-control spending and massive debt. I yield back to my colleague, and I appreciate his leadership on this matter.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Indiana reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
It's now my pleasure to yield 1.5 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Honda.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for yielding time to me. I rise in opposition to this resolution, but I am strongly in favor of the process that we are using to deal with that limit. There's a difference. If this resolution to force an unprecedented default passes both this House and the Senate, the President can decide to sign it or not. But even if he doesn't sign it, Congress will have another opportunity to stop a debt ceiling raise. This is a process that the Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, first suggested in 2011, and it has been used in debt limits bills to avoid defaulting since. It is good enough to use right now. It has been good enough to use for 2 years, and it's good enough to help us avoid these manufactured crises on a permanent basis. This is a process that helps us separate the true need for congressional intervention on the debt limit from those that are manufactured and motivated by politics. This is a process that works and helps us avoid unnecessary pain. We should never have a replay of the hostage-taking and brinksmanship that recently we went through to get to this point. We know what we have to do, and we know we should not be playing games with the debt limit. And that is why I offered a bill that would make this process permanent and keep this nation fiscally solvent. Senators Boxer, Schumer, and Hirono introduced this very same bill today in the Senate. I support this process. Thank you.
Additional half minute.
Thank you. I support this process, and I hope my colleagues will support my efforts to make it the permanent solution to our debt crisis. I urge a no vote on the resolution, but I support this process that allows it. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Michigan reserves. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
I yield 5 minutes to a distinguished member of the Ways and Means Committee, my friend and colleague, Mr. Griffin from Arkansas.
The gentleman from Arkansas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in support of House Joint Resolution 99 offered by the gentleman from Indiana, my good friend and colleague on the House Ways and Means Committee. And I want to be clear, this is not a resolution for default. This is an opportunity to talk about how we have got to, when raising the debt ceiling, deal with the underlying drivers of the debt. History shows numerous instances in which spending cuts and reforms have been coupled with increases in the debt limit. This dates back to the inception of the debt ceiling limit in 1917. It also includes 2 instances during the 110th Congress when President Obama served in the Senate. Further, in March 2006, then Senator Obama voted against raising the debt limit. And we've heard some folks tonight talk about how they agree with President Obama. Well, let's listen to what he said in March 2006. Quote, "Increasing America's debt weakens us domestically and internationally. Leadership means that the buck stops here. Instead, Washington is shifting the burden of bad choices today onto the backs of our children and grandchildren. America has a debt problem and a failure of leadership. Americans deserve better," end quote. Well, I also agree with then Senator, now President Obama. And it's abundantly clear that no one is going to fail to raise the debt ceiling. No one is going to jeopardize our credit. But we must speak out on the failure to address the debt drivers. In July 2008, then Senator Obama said that adding $4 trillion to the national debt over 8 years was, quote, irresponsible, end quote, and, quote, unpatriotic. I agree with him then. What he said then. Since he became president in 2009, President Obama has increased the total federal debt from $10.6 trillion to over $17 trillion. One has to wonder what then Senator Obama would have to say about President Obama. He has continually called for raising the debt ceiling during his presidency without implementing any of the necessary reforms needed to get our federal spending under control. My focus has always been on working with anyone who's willing to find a real long-term solution to Washington's spending addiction. This resolution shows the House is ready to start talking across party lines about how to fix our debt problems now, not at the next deadline. Late last year, CNN reported that the United States spends about 71 cents of every federal tax dollar it collects on what's called the Big Four: Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the debt. If nothing is done, in just 13 years, the Big Four could eat up every penny of tax revenue collected by the federal government, leaving nothing to pay for the discretionary spending that we like. That includes spending on defense, veterans benefits, education, roads, national parks, museums, medical research, food safety, and air traffic control, to name a few. CNN further said that by 2040, more than half of all federal tax revenue would be eaten up by interest payments on the debt alone. In 2006, then Senator Obama said, quote, "Those interest payments are a significant tax on all Americans, a debt tax that Washington doesn't want to talk about," end quote. But let's be clear. House Republicans in Congress and the voters who put us here are the only reason anyone in August of 2011 talked about the debt problem and reached a debt deal. Otherwise, the President would have simply had the debt ceiling raised and there would have been nothing done structurally. And we're the only reason why we talk about it now. Otherwise, it would be a clean debt ceiling increase with no strings attached. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this important resolution and getting our excessive spending under control. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Indiana reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
The gentleman ready to close?
I am ready to close.
Okay,
Reserve the balance of time.
I yield myself the balance over time, and I'll speak very briefly because the message here is so clear that those who vote for this bill are saying they're willing to use the threat of default once again. And we shouldn't be doing this. I don't think the nation believed that this government and its programs would be shut down. But it turned out, because of the way the Republicans handled it, this government was shut down, and programs were very much undercut that were needed by the people of this country. We came within a flicker of default. The consequences of playing with that were very, very substantial. And so now, once again, the Republicans bring up a bill, and whatever the reason is, are giving people a chance once again to say that playing with default is a legitimate method of operation. You shouldn't do this. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
So, Mr. Speaker, in closing, I'd just like to reiterate 5 key points. 1, our current national debt exceeds $17 trillion, an amount that's greater than our annual GDP, the size of our economy. 2, while I and so many others in my party agree with many of my colleagues across the aisle that risking default is irresponsible, it's just as irresponsible to ignore why our debt is so darn high and what it means for the future of our country. 3, we can and must work across partisan lines to avoid default in conjunction with a debt ceiling vote or a default related to a continued failure to address the largest drivers of our debt. And we must begin that work now, not at the last minute of the next self-imposed fiscal deadline. 4, those who've served here for decades have known for decades that our population was growing older, that health care costs were rising, and that our long-term fiscal trajectory was unsustainable, but nothing has happened. 5, this recognition that Washington continually misses opportunities to put our country on a path to fiscal health ought to be something on which we can all agree. I urge all my colleagues who want to see our country address our long-term challenges before it's too late to vote yes on this resolution of disapproval. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to the statute, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the engrossment and the third reading of the joint resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair,
a recorded vote.
The chair, the ayes have it. Third reading. The question is on
a joint resolution relating to the disapproval of the President's exercise of authority to suspend the debt limit as submitted under Section 1002B of the Continuing Appropriations Act 2014 on October 17, 2013.
The question is on the passage of the joint resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of the Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. Chair will entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for one minute.
In about 2 hours today in Houston at the Lakewood Church, we in Houston will honor the famed, the humble, and the especially loved all Andrew Bum Phillips, our favorite coach, Coach Bum Phillips of the Houston Oilers, our friend, my friend. We lost Coach Phillips October 18, 2013, at his home, his ranch in Texas. I offer to his wife, his son, and daughters, and grandchildren and great-grandchildren my deepest sympathy. But I know as he is honored this evening, there will be a celebration of his life. For Bum Phillips was the kind of character-building leader that led young men into the most winningest franchise of the then Houston Oilers. He did it because he had a championship spirit, and he had the ability to add quips to anything that you would ask him. When asked one time about Earl Campbell, he said, "What kind of class is Earl Campbell in? He may not be in a class all by himself, but it doesn't take long to call the roll." When asked about the Dallas Cowboys as America's team, Bum said, "The Dallas Cowboys may be America's team, but the Houston Oilers are Texas' team." Tonight I know there will be many who will celebrate his life and the service he gave. I want to thank Mike Barber for organizing this great effort. I will miss being there. But Bum, I want to thank you, Coach Bum Phillips. I want to thank you for the joy you brought to Houston, the excitement of the team, the spirit of winning and losing, the fairness and the balance that you added to those young men that were under your tutelage. You went on to coach the New Orleans Saints, but you will always be special in our hearts. And I hope this body will offer a moment of silence for our dear friend, the nation's friend, Texas friend, Coach Bum Phillips. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing this tribute on the floor to this great American, Coach Bum Phillips. I yield back.
Time has expired. Chair lays before the House the following personal request.
Leave of absence is requested for Mr. Rush of Illinois for October 28 to October 30th, 2013.
Without objection, the request is granted. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, is recognized for 60 minutes as designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On this evening of October 29th, we commemorate the one-year anniversary of Superstorm Sandy, which devastated the East Coast. Many are still recovering from that tragic storm, and it certainly was a major force to be reckoned with. That force of nature was at one point nearly 1,000 miles wide over the ocean front, and when it landed in southern Jersey, it was nearly 900 miles wide. It impacted so many states, 24 states in number, felt the impact of that superstorm. It was devastation to property. It was devastation to lives. 162 people in the United States lost their lives. And the fact that the storm surged to some record proportions reminds us of the impact of climate change. Now, as a member of the New York delegation in this House, my area received some mild impact from that superstorm, but ironically the year before, Hurricane Irene and Lee impacted the upstate region of New York and again devastated our area with loss of life, certainly of valuable farmland that was eroded, and the damage to communities and businesses and farm businesses across the upstate region. These are issues that are brought to mind this evening as we commemorate that one-year anniversary, as many continue to struggle to recover from the ravages of Mother Nature. The cost of climate inaction is severe. Climate change is an issue of science. It's certainly an issue of public health, and most definitely it's an issue of economics, economic vitality. Earlier, the Sustainable Energy and Environmental Coalition, which is a growing number, 56 to be exact, of Democrats in the House, looking to bring about significant policy reforms that speak to the environmental and energy needs of this nation, began to provide a laser-sharp focus on the cost of climate change to our economy. In 2011 and 2012, there were some 25 extreme weather events that caused at least $1 billion each or more in damages. Total estimated economic damages were approaching $200 billion, and the cost to taxpayers some $136 billion. The cost to individual taxpayers at some totaled $1,610 million. So we know that there's a tremendous impact here that has been realized by the lack of a focus onto climate change and global warming. As we continue to look at recovery, even from Irene and Lee in the upstate New York portion, as we look at the impact, the ravages of damage that came with Superstorm Sandy, as we look at the damage recently to Colorado, and if we look at the other extreme, not rainfall and flooding, but certainly at drought, and looking at the fires, the wildfires that have consumed some states in our country, there is definitely economic consequence that comes with climate change. In my territory, in my area that is part of the 20th Congressional District, it becomes very apparent that we need to do more than just replace. If data compiled are telling us that extreme rainfall has been part of the last decade or two, wise, effective government will not merely replace, but reevaluate how to reconfigure, for instance, a bridge that may traverse one of the creeks, I know that that's the case in many locations. Looking at electric utilities, looking at what withstood the pressures of the storm, combined heat and power systems that we'll talk about during this hour that apparently withstood greater pressure than some of the traditional systems. So we go forward with not just merely replacement, but we go forward with a renewal, a revisioning of how to take that area that was affected and make it work again. That's sound government. That's effective government. Tonight we're joined by several colleagues. We're joined by Representative Rush from the state of New Jersey, Representative Rush Holt from the state of New Jersey, and we're joined by Representative Scott Peters from the state of California. We may be visited by other colleagues this evening who are going to talk about impacts they have seen perhaps in their region and talk about the science, the economics related to climate change. And so I believe we, through SEEK, through the Sustainable Energy and Environmental Coalition, have brought about the discussion, have developed the dialogue, have encouraged the moving forward, if you will, on this very important dynamic, understanding it full well so that we can move into prevention. Because the question asked here by a growing number of colleagues is how long can we afford to go without a plan of action before we understand that the cost of replacement or renewal or transformation is going to drain the taxpayers, is going to drain the individuals and families impacted, the businesses impacted, and no one wins in that scenario. So, Representative Rush Holt, if you would like to share some thoughts this evening as we begin our hour, we welcome you.
I thank my friend Mr. Tonko from New York for arranging this discussion. It is well worth recognizing the anniversary of this devastating storm because it might be said this was this was a storm like we've never seen before. That may be true. But I don't think it's correct to say this is a storm such as we will never see again. A year ago, Hurricane Sandy devastated New Jersey and much of the East Coast. The storm may have faded from the headlines, but New Jerseyans haven't forgotten. It is felt in a very personal and painful way by thousands and thousands of New Jerseyans yet today. And these New Jerseyans are not alone. I mean that in two senses. First, we can hear from some who are representative of the millions, but also when we hear from the younger New Jerseyans who are affected, we understand that they represent the future that will be affected by climate change. Quite simply, superstorms like Sandy are the new normal, and we'd better get used to it, even if climate change skeptics claim otherwise. I think response to Sandy means, of course, tending to the human needs of those who have been victims of the storm. But it also means making significant investments in power engineering and transportation engineering and rail engineering and wireless engineering and shoreline engineering and river flood control engineering and residential planning, and taking steps to deal with the root cause of what we see. We may not be able to stop hurricanes in their tracks. In fact, we certainly can't. But we can make sure that our infrastructure and our environment and our communities are more resilient when they strike. And if we work hard as a nation and as humanity, we may be able to stem the climate change that will result in more and more powerful superstorms.
I know some in Washington are skeptical of the role of the federal government in fighting climate change, but as Sandy's $83 billion price tag should make clear, society, our economy, yes, and our government will bear the costs of climate change one way or another. And if we make the investments today, as the debts are coming due, we would do far better than to wait to pick up the pieces after other superstorms hit. And I thank my friend from New York. I'll be happy as we go along to talk about some specific New Jerseyans who were affected. I'll be happy to talk about some of the science that suggests where we are as a world. But mostly, I just want to make the point that this is the new normal that we should be prepared for.
Thank you very much, Representative Holt. And certainly your state, my home state, suffered economic consequences to the nth degree. And it's a stark reminder that the cost of inaction